If you remember back a little bit on the channel now, I tested what's called the lever movement system. It's this bungee looking apparatus where it unloads your body weight and allows you to run the treadmill at a much lighter load. Like it can take off significant amounts of weight so you can run and feel really bouncy and light. But what does it actually do, and what are the impacts physiologically when we do use this device from a running perspective? Obviously a great tool for returning from injury, but can it have effect on our general training, and what is it going to do when we do unload ourselves from body weight? How does that impact some of our physiological metrics? That's exactly what I tested. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. So if you've been following the channel, we did a comparative video of when I tested end of last year, beginning of my preparations. I was at a relatively unfit point in time, worked all the way through a couple of months worth of really solid endurance training over the summer. Then we retested again. 7 days post that test, I jumped on the lever system. I thought, let's test out the physiological characteristics of unloaded running, taking some body weight off me and seeing what it changes. I hadn't seen any change in fitness over that time because it was exactly 7 days apart from when I did my normal test, if you like, at full body weight, no assistance. Let's jump on and see what the changes to things like VO2, things like heart rate, power, our ventilation, all of these metrics we measured before, except for blood lactate. That's not something I tested, I might do in the future, but what actually changes when we go and do some unloaded running? Now, as a comparative point, I unloaded myself by about 12 or so kilos. So I dropped myself down from about 70 odd kilos at normal, unassisted, if you like, to an assisted running load of about 58 kilos. So it was a significant drop. The lever system allows you to adjust this, and I might play around with the different varying amounts that you can take body weight off. But just for the purpose of this testing, I took it 2 notches on the bungee cord. There's actually some spacing for it. But I took it 2 notches just to see what the impact would have, and it had some significant impact, and we'll get into the data in a moment. From a expectations perspective, what did I expect? I probably expected to see economy be a bit better. I expect it to assist me. I expected it overall to just be an easier, more comfortable run. And that's really what we saw. So let's now dive into some of the data from testing on the lever and what does unloaded running actually look like from a physiological metrics perspective. Because intuitively, no, it should be much more comfortable for us, should be much easier. Did it actually represent in the data? Let's jump into that right now. So now I've had a chance to dive right into the data and make a few comparisons between where was I at physiologically, or where is everything at normal body weight, how are we going from a what did training achieve perspective, versus no fitter, but on the lever, unloading myself to 58 kilos. So we'll start with heart rate because I think that's a really good one, really practical one for any of you watching who are maybe considering, is this device worth getting and what insights would you be able to obtain day to day. Obviously the oxygen consumption data that we'll get to in a moment is really interesting data to look at, but heart rate is really intuitive. Like most people, if not all endurance athletes, have some form of way to monitor their heart rate, whether it's a chest strap, Wahoo ticker, Polar H10, HRM Pro from Garmin, or whether it's on your wrist watch using the optical sensor underneath there, or an alternative way of measuring heart rate. Really practical way. So what are the insights that you're going to be able to take away from this? And the first one is a pretty significantly lower heart rate. So if we look into it here, the green line represents me running unloaded at about that 58 kilos. The orange line represents where am I at physiologically with no assistance at all. Same treadmill, same conditions, same lab, all of that as we saw before. So looking at the difference here, pretty significantly lower heart rates observed when we are assisted. And this is aligned with what our hypothesis was at the beginning. It should be easier, and it definitely was, and I felt that. In terms of the scale and magnitude of how much easier, huge amount. I probably didn't anticipate it to be this different in terms of heart rate. That surprised me in a really positive way. Looking at some of the numbers down here, 10 kilometers an hour, very sub-maximal intensity, 6-minute K pace. You can see without any assistance, I normally run or have been running around 140 beats per minute. I quite often have a bit of an elevated heart rate. I don't do massive Ks in terms of my own training. I have been increasing that. So this is actually a much lower heart rate than potentially what I would normally go back 4 or 5 months. My heart rate probably would have been a bit higher this again. So comparative to a lot of you, this might seem like some high heart rate numbers. Ignore that and just look at this for what it is. But looking at the same pace unloaded, taking off 12 kilos has dropped my heart rate to 117 beat per minute average across that stage of the test. And you can see here, we average about 25 to somewhere between 25 to 30 beats lower, or 23 to 30 is the spread, but I guess 25 to 26 is probably a good average in the middle, lower, which is a significant drop, massively different physiological investment, not having to work anywhere near as hard. And I sort of look at this and go, really good way, potentially, for obviously those who are injured and come back from injury, this is a good alternative to running at full body weight, of course. But if we're going to manipulate some of our zone 2, particularly the very, very low zone 2 work that for a lot of runners is actually very difficult to achieve, and me in particular, like if I'm trying to elicit a heart rate of sub 130, you can see here, unassisted, running at sub 130 beats per minute is probably going to require me to fast walk. If we go too much slower, if we go down to 9 k's an hour, 640 pace, we go down to 8 k's an hour, 730 pace, we go down to 7 k's an hour, we sort of look at the trend of what my heart rate was doing. I'd probably have to go as low as like 8 minute 30 per kilometre or slower pace, which is effectively a fast walk, to be able to get that heart rate down below 130, 125 beats per minute. You can see here, everything up to 5 minute K pace is sub 130 beats per minute. 436 pace at 13 k's an hour, 135. Really great way of potentially getting some very low zone 2. That's going to obviously improve some of our physiological characteristics, so really great training stimulus. But ultimately, we're making it much easier to achieve that. So are we actually increasing the effectiveness of training time is something I'm going to be really interested in looking at over the next little while. Now, if we do start to get a little bit more on the technical side of things, something a little bit less accessible to go and test yourself if you were using one of these systems is obviously our oxygen consumption. But what this oxygen consumption will highlight and shows clearly, again, much, much lower, like green line significantly lower, and not as much change between the stages. You can see there the differentials, really, the higher the intensity we went, the more of a difference we had in terms of oxygen consumption. But even then, 10 mils per minute, 11, 14 and 16 mils per minute lower in terms of relative oxygen consumption, mils per kilo per minute there, clearly much more economical. And that makes a lot of sense. Like you think about this comparison here would be the same as if I ran at full body weight versus me running with a 10 kilo backpack. That's just happening in reverse and would make my economy worse. I'd need a greater oxygen cost to overcome that workload or create that output. Here, I'm going in reverse. I'm taking the weight off, so it should make it easier. And heart rate being linked very directly to VO2, we know that in terms of you look at a ramp test or a progressive step test, as oxygen consumption goes up, so too will heart rate and vice versa. This makes a lot of sense that the oxygen consumption and oxygen cost should be significantly lower, and that's what we see. So no real surprises out of these first two variables here. I don't think anyone's necessarily surprised here. I think the scale of which they improved and how much easier it made it, I think that's the really interesting one, and how that translates to speed. I mean, looking at oxygen consumption here of 30 mils per kilo per minute for 5 minute K pace versus 46 at 5 minute K pace at full body weight. I sort of look at that and go, the calorie investment or the energy requirement is much more efficient. Potentially, does that have an effect on us being able to recover up and get ready for a session then later in the day, the following day, using the lever strategically throughout the week might actually give us better chance to, again, get that better training stimulus, achieve some low zone 2, but also allow us to be fresher and ready to go for future training sessions. Like it's not just necessarily the here and now, it's preparing for those sessions where we might have to be fresher to go really hard or push really hard for a longer period of time in a threshold session, a VO2 session, whatever it might be, even just a hard endurance or tempo type session. This might be a good way to really get the low intensity stuff to be a very low intensity and also low strain on the system, so that we can have a better result later around the rest of the week. So some really interesting findings here. I'm really positive about potentially how we can manipulate this and how I might be able to incorporate this into some training for myself and the athletes I work with to be able to get a better training stimulus overall when we're trying to develop some really, really positive endurance characteristics. And then finally, just another metric that I think is becoming more and more relevant for more and more people who are starting to use running power. And this is obviously measured through the Stride Power Meter, the FootPod. I've actually really enjoyed using that over the last little while. So might do a bit of a video on my experiences using Stride. But what I did here was measure throughout what was that power output, because this is just one of those other, variables that we can look at. Well, almost a bit of an exertion, so to speak. Like, yes, heart rate was lower. Did it translate to a lower power output? It clearly did. The thing we have to consider with Stride, though, is that body weight does make up part of that calculation process or algorithm process of getting running power. I really like it as a metric, and I find it really intuitive for zone 2 running in terms of running to a power number. So clearly in this testing, like using the power meter, we can see it's a much lower outcome, and that's it directly aligned with what we expect in heart rate. So again, we're seeing these same patterns over and over in terms of definitely making these submaximal workloads much easier. The thing I haven't tested here is the more maximal stuff, and that might be something again in the future as well that we continue to test and look at. Am I going to be able to run those based on this? You would assume I'm going to be able to run those faster. Yes, probably. But what is that going to have as a benefit? Like having the faster turnover, is that going to allow me to be able to translate some of that faster speed into my unloaded running or not really? Is it more the utility at the low end? Like these are the questions we're going to continue to ask on the channel over the next little while. One thing I will say with running on the lever with the power meter is because body weight filters into that algorithm, you have to change the body weight. So thank you to Zach, one of my triathletes who were discussing the results of this and some of the things, and he did, and what the outcomes we were sort of assessing for, and what I was going to be testing for and looking at. And he actually did bring up a really good point that you're going to have to go and change your body weight. And I hadn't initially thought about that, but then it makes a lot of sense because that's how the Stride algorithm works. And changing the body weight in there does make the difference. I've gone and tested it without changing my body weight in the algorithm, and you end up with very similar power numbers. So the pod only really knows that you're unloaded weight if you put yourself in, which is why when you jump on, you hook yourself into the system, the bungee rope, taking off enough resistance or taking off enough body weight using the markers that they've got on the bungee cord is one way of knowing. But I chuck a set of scales on the treadmill, weigh myself beforehand, and then hook myself in, stand on the scales, keep taking it off until I'm at that precise amount, and I know exactly what to put back into Stride to change that. You do then have to remember to change it back when you then go out and run outdoors. So just something to keep in mind in the future there as well. But again, similar to what we expected. I don't think anyone's really overly surprised by some of these drops in data, but again, looking at the significance, 45, almost 50 watts lower is a really big difference. And as we go higher in intensity, that's where some of those bigger discrepancies start to occur. So I think that being able to run a low zone 2 or a mid zone 2 heart rate and power at a bit faster speed, that's that interesting dynamic I'm really excited to play with over the next little while. So that's a bit of a summary and a wrap up of all the data from testing my unassisted versus the assisted in terms of running without and with the lever movement device. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. What was the most interesting insight? Did some of these results align with what you thought would happen? Like I said, I wasn't overly surprised with the direction of the results. I think it's just the magnitude for me and the size of difference taking off 12 kilos really had. And I think it's a really interesting thing we can continue to explore on the channel. Let me know what else you want me to test with this system. Is there anything in particular you want me to go and assess? Do we want to do some higher intensity work? Do we want to try different body weights being removed? Let me know in the comments down below. Always happy to hear your thoughts. But otherwise, that's going to wrap it up for this one today. Hopefully got plenty out of it. Keep supporting the channel. Really enjoy making these types of videos and doing some things with some different technologies over the last little while. Been really interesting to play with and get some insights for my own performance, but also hopefully it's helping you in the process as well. So I'm going to leave it there for today. Thanks for watching this one, and we'll see you in the next one.